Hey guys, my name is Joanna, also known as Just Another Flutist here on YouTube, and right now I'm actually in between students and I was kind of inspired by my lessons to make this video for you guys. Just a little bit of a background, I teach lessons online. So I teach on FaceTime, Skype. I'm gonna think about trying other platforms as well, but that's a whole nother story. But basically, all of my students have found me through this channel, and anyone who has found me through this channel tend to be very self-driven, independent, and a lot of you guys are self-taught, which takes a whole lot of discipline. I've made a couple videos just for you self-taught peeps out there, so I have a pretty good idea of how you guys work. With that amount of discipline, you do a lot of your own research, and with all that research comes a lot of recordings. So when you guys work on orchestral excerpts, when you guys work on like your repertoire and stuff like that, I noticed that you guys go on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, anywhere you can to grab recordings of the pieces you're working on, and you use that as your models to emulate. So those are really good things. But I just wanted to give you guys a few tips to avoid some blind spots that you can have while using all those recordings as your models. The first big thing that happens is that your sense of how time passes, your sense of how the tempo feels, stuff like that, it actually sounds very different from a third-person perspective than it does for you feeling it yourself. This problem happens in two places. I've talked about one before. When you hear very fast passages, they sound faster from a third-person perspective than they feel when you play them yourself. So for example, like if I were just to like rip up and down a scale, pretty basic D major, it sounds really fast though, right? Now I'm going to try and play it as fast as I hear myself playing. Like, I can still make out every single individual note. Everything kind of goes slow-mo, you know, like when you're playing it yourself. So you can end up going really fast and playing very clearly and cleanly simply because your perspective of how fast something is going is a little bit different from your listener's perspective of how fast you're going. If you hear like really fast passages, they may not actually be going as fast as you think they are. Check with your metronome. The second spot that this happens in is kind of like the polar opposite. So like super long notes. There's actually two things that can happen with really long notes. One is you hear the flutist in those recordings playing it and you're like, holy crap, that's really, really long. You end up thinking to yourself, okay, so that means that I need to hold the notes super long too. You count through the beats and you're like, this doesn't feel long enough. So you end up holding it longer. And the second thing that can happen is like the opposite, especially if the tempo is very slow. So if you're looking at something that's like 1, 2, 3, 4, like that's pretty slow, okay? Now let's say you have to hold that for like 4 bars or something, you know? When you hear the flutist playing it in those recordings, it may not actually sound that long because you may actually be listening to the parts underneath the flutist. Then when you go to play that part by yourself with no accompanist and no orchestra underneath you, you can lose the sense of like how long you've been holding it for. And you know, once you've been holding it for a while, you're like, wow, this is getting really awkward. You know, it's probably long enough now. And then you kind of stop. And by that point, you've stopped way too early. So a lot of times, you know, if you're looking at a note that's tied over 3 or 4 bars, I found that a lot of students tend to accidentally leave out the last 1 or 2 bars altogether because they're just like doubting themselves, especially when they're playing in front of me, their teacher. There's a lot of self-doubt that kind of causes you to question yourself as to how far you've counted to. Keep that in mind. Check with a metronome. Use the metronome as like kind of your evaluator. Then there's another aspect I've noticed, which is to do with expression. There is a possibility of confusing expression with the actual rhythm. For example, if you do something like low and slow, okay, I'm gonna make something up. So let's say you play something that sounds like very like mysterious, right? We're looking at a dotted quarter with 2/16 and another dotted quarter with 2/16. Now, if you listen to me play it and then you try to do it yourself and you try to do it with the same expression, you may accidentally hold the dotted quarter for way too long, because in an effort to make it more expressive, you end up hanging on to it too long. So do you notice that I've held it for like about a beat more than what I did earlier? You want that leaning into that dotted quarter without stretching it a whole extra beat. It's like taking a tenuto way too far. So you still want the lean, but you don't want to elongate it. So if ever you run into that kind of problem where like there's an expressive bit where you find that you have no idea where the beat is, check if this is happening with you. And again, use the metronome to evaluate. The metronome will tell you whether your rhythm is correct or not, but at the same time, like, don't forego the expression altogether. You still want all the leans and the lilts. At the same time, don't stray so far from the rhythm that you're like adding extra beats or taking out a lot of beats. That makes sense. Now, the last thing that I noticed, you'll listen to a bunch of recordings and you may realize that no two people play the exact same repertoire in exactly the same way. No one's wrong. Everyone's interpretation is valid if they can back it up. You're basically hearing a bunch of personal interpretations of the music. What's interesting though is that if you kind of compare directly all of these different recordings, you'll find that people will generally lean on a certain note. They'll generally, you know, do some rubato in a certain area. They'll generally do a crescendo here. They'll generally breathe here. You can kind of pick out general expressive things that are typically done in the piece, but you'll find that it manifests slightly differently for everyone. Maybe you would lean a little bit harder on a note than another person would, or maybe that person will tend to have a little bit more of an exaggerated rubato than you. You can actually use emulation as a way of seeing what works for you. So I would actually try to completely imitate every single recording that you hear of the same repertoire. Play with the recording and try and imitate them exactly. And when you do that to several recordings, you can kind of get a feel of what you like, what you don't like, what feels natural to you, and what doesn't feel natural to you. After you do that, after a while, you can kind of mix and match what you like, what feels natural to you. At that point, once you sort of felt it out a little bit more, you can kind of look at the music to see if the way you read the music agrees with your interpretation. Instead of looking at all these recordings and being like, which one is right? All of them are right, but you need to pick out what's right for you from all of them. Mix and match. There you have it. That has kind of been the theme of my last few weeks of lessons, actually, with my students. So I thought this would make a great video topic, and also I'm actually in between students right now. If I were to teach you, I would look like this. Like this is what our lesson would look like, except with not as high definition camera. I hope this was helpful and insightful for you guys. Let me know in the comments whether you have any more questions regarding this topic. As usual, if you like this video, make sure you give me a big thumbs up and hit subscribe for new videos every Saturday. This is my last video, which I will put a link to up here for you guys. If you want to support me, head on over to my Patreon. Otherwise, you can catch me on my social media networks, which are listed down below. And I will see you guys next week. Bye. Oh. Thumb port. Okay, finger port.